And I'd very much like to welcome our first speakers, Dee Rosier and Professor Ian Norman, who are going to be talking about reducing distress and building resilience in the talking therapies. So I shall hand over to my esteemed colleagues here.
Good morning, can you hear me okay? Yeah, upstairs? Lovely. So, my name is Dee Rosier and this is Professor Ian Norman, and Ian is Deputy Dean of the Florence Nightingale School of Nursing and Midwifery. Ian and I met in 2011, and over the last 3 years we've been working together on the issue of reducing distress and building resilience in one of the talking therapies. And we're presenting to you today some of that work. So here are our aims for this session, which we hope will be interesting and useful to you all. We're going to present a case study based on our clinical experience. Through this, we're going to present some principles of cognitive behavioural therapy, and then there will be an opportunity for some discussion and questions. So, I'm the case study, and Ian was my therapist. And my history, in 10 seconds, is that I was first taken to my GP with depression aged 11. I had my first psychiatric admission aged 19, and I was discharged from secondary services aged 47 4 months ago. I was diagnosed with a personality disorder when I was 19, having previously been diagnosed as also suffering from anxiety and depression. Now, in those days, personality disorders were considered untreatable, so I was only treated for anxiety and depression with a combination of medication and various forms of talking therapy. Here's the DSM-4, the Mental Health Diagnostic Manual, describing the symptoms of emotionally unstable personality disorder. The major symptoms of this disorder revolve around unstable relationships, poor or negative sense of self, inconsistent moods, and significant impulsivity. There's an intense fear of abandonment with this disorder that interferes with many aspects of the individual's life. This fear often acts as a self-fulfilling prophecy, as they cling to others, are very needy, feel helpless, and become overly involved and immediately attached. When the fear of abandonment becomes overwhelming, they'll often push others out of their life as if trying to avoid getting rejected. The cycle most often continues, as the individual will then try everything to get people back in his or her life, and once again become clingy, needy, and helpless. The fact that people do often leave someone who exhibits this behaviour only proves to support their distorted belief that they're insignificant, worthless, and unloved. At this point in the cycle, the individual may exhibit self-harming behaviours such as suicide attempts, mock suicide attempts where the goal is to get rescued and lure others back into the individual's life, cutting or other self-mutilating behaviour. There's often intense and sudden anger, directed both at self and others, as well as a difficulty controlling destructive behaviours. So how on earth might you repair or treat that? Well, I can tell you that the talking treatments I received over a period of more than 2 decades really did nothing for me, beyond temporarily feeling cared for by the therapist, and it cost the NHS an awful lot of money. Although I could conceptualise and intellectualise things, as discussed in the talking treatments relating to my anxiety and depression, the personality disorder stopped anything really shifting for me, especially after each course of treatment finished. To some limited extent, my behaviours changed, although usually only temporarily, but not the underlying thoughts, feelings, and core beliefs. And now I want to focus on one of the things that very much did work. In 2002, after another inpatient stay when I was in my mid-30s, I was referred to a therapeutic community consisting of a 9-month programme of 3 days a week, then 1 day a week for a year, followed by a range of daytime and then evening groups over the next few years. And I was also put on a mood stabiliser, antipsychotic, at the beginning of this course of treatment, and I believe that this was very helpful, as I think it ameliorated the worst excesses of my symptoms so that I could fully engage with the programme without being tipped over the edge. 12 years later, I'm nearly completely off my antidepressants after more than 30 years, at my own instigation, but I have no plans to ever come off my mood stabiliser. So here's a technical description of the model. A therapeutic community is a planned environment which exploits the therapeutic value of social and group processes. It promotes equitable and democratic group living in a varied, permissive, but safe environment. Interpersonal and emotional issues are openly discussed, and members can form intimate relationships. Mutual feedback helps members confront their problems and develop an awareness of interpersonal actions. And this slide illustrates how the model works functionally. So we start off understanding that the key purpose is to care for and about the inner child. We fundamentally recognise the importance of attachment and maladapted attachments. There's no such thing as bad behaviours. There's a culture of inquiry and curiosity, and everything is there to be examined, thought about and looked at. The community provides a network of supportive and challenging relationships and recognises the empowering potential of giving appropriate responsibility. So I made some great progress at my therapeutic community, and I no longer have a diagnosis of a personality disorder, which I remind you was considered incurable when I was first diagnosed. But my anxiety and depression remained, and in fact my anxiety worsened as I tried to push out into the world. So fast forward 10 years to when I was assessed in 2011, at which point I was suffering from crippling anxiety, phobias, a constant stream of negative thoughts and voices, several nightmares each night, flashbacks triggered by anything and everything, and paranoia. These collectively severely impacted on every area of my life, and I was then offered 30 sessions of schema CBT with Ian.
So, he was offered 30 sessions of one of the talking therapies. And the talking therapies are a diverse group of treatments in which talking is the main process by which people work out how to deal with negative thoughts and feelings and make positive changes in their lives. So what image comes to your mind when you think of the talking therapies? Is it something like this? Here's an image from one of Woody Allen's films where he is in session with his analyst. Here the patient talks about his thoughts, including free associations, fantasies and dreams, and childhood experiences. The role of the analyst is to identify unconscious conflicts which are hypothesized to cause the patient's symptoms and to provide the patient with insight which will in turn resolve his problems. And I show this image to highlight some major differences between classical psychoanalysis and cognitive behaviour therapy, which is the sort of talking therapy which Dee and I pursued. So what are the main characteristics of cognitive behaviour therapy, or CBT? Collaborative working. In the Woody Allen example, the therapist is the expert, working on the patient who waits to receive expert advice. In contrast, a key feature of CBT is a collaborative relationship in which the therapist and the client work as a team to achieve the client's goals. And a widely used analogy is of the client and therapist working together like two scientists, testing out and evaluating the effects of particular techniques to see if they help. And if they don't, then working out what's been learned and then working out what to do next. So, how important is the quality of the relationship between the therapist and the client? Dee's already mentioned that in her previous therapy, she received some caring from the therapist and found that as helpful. Well, it's certainly true that the relationship between the client and the therapist is important. And in fact, we know that this is true across all the talking therapies. A positive therapy alliance is correlated to the success of treatment in all talking therapies. But for me, a positive therapy alliance alone does not ensure the best therapy outcome, unless it is supported by evidence-based therapy methods. So really, you need a combination. And indeed, there is evidence that positive therapy potentiates the effectiveness of therapeutic techniques, and that using the effective techniques leads to a more positive therapy alliance. So a therapy alliance will help the techniques, good techniques improve the therapy alliance. A cognitive orientation. What we know is that people react differently to similar events. Even events as obviously terrible as suffering a bereavement do not produce the same emotional state in everyone. Some people may be emotionally devastated by a bereavement, others cope reasonably well. So it's not just events that cause emotions. There must be something else. And for CBT therapists, that something else is cognition. That is the interpretation that people make of an event. So it isn't what happens to you that's important in determining your emotional reaction. It's how you interpret that event. It's what that event means to you. But it's not only our thoughts that are important, it's also our behaviour. Because what we do is crucial in maintaining or changing our emotional state. And so sometimes changing what we do is the most effective way of helping us feel better and having more positive thoughts. A continuum. In contrast to some medical approaches, CBT therapists see mental health difficulties as exaggerated or extreme versions of normal mental processes, rather than as pathological states. We all feel anxious or depressed from time to time. We all have negative thoughts. Mental health difficulties are at one end of a continuum which all of us are on somewhere. A here and now focus. The main focus of CBT is on what's happening in the here and now, rather than the processes that might have led to the development of today's difficulties many years ago. That's not to say that early experiences are not important. They are, but we can't change them, and their primary impact is on our ability to manage the challenges in the present. This here and now focus is in contrast to Woody Allen's analyst, who would probably take the view that symptoms of a problem are superficial and that successful treatment must uncover the developmental processes, hidden motivations and unconscious conflicts that lie at the root of any problem. So, what are the primary goals of therapy in CBT? First, clients will have their own personal goals that they want to achieve, but there are two primary goals of CBT for most clients, and the first is the relief of distress. And the second, and in many cases more important, is building resilience, which is one of the main themes of this summer school. So resilience, what is resilience? It's about how people negotiate adversity. And building resilience describes processes of psychological adaptation through which people draw upon their strengths to adapt to challenges and so maintain their well-being. Building resilience is a crucial goal for CBT, because if improvement is to be maintained and to be built upon, the client needs to become their own therapist. They need to walk away at the end of therapy with a toolkit of cognitive and behavioural skills and know how to apply them to manage future life problems and maintain and protect their mental health. And when Dee and I worked together, we developed a resilient type goal, which became a key touchstone for her recovery. And the goal was, and perhaps still is, to develop a stable sense of self which is able to cope with life's ups and downs. The starting point of CBT is for the therapist and the client to work together to understand how the client's problems are maintained. And for this purpose, it's helpful to think of problems as the result of interactions between 4 systems: cognition, our thoughts; affect or emotions, that's our feelings; our behaviour; and physiology, physical sensations. So let's take a simple example with which you may be familiar: taking an examination tomorrow morning. So when you think of your exam, what goes through your mind? Is it, I've done my revision thoroughly and I've got every reason to be confident, which leads you to feel confident and physically relaxed? So you go to bed early, you sleep well, the next day you wake feeling rested and focused, and you give the exam your best shot. Or for you, is it a bit more like this, where your dominant thought the night before is, I should have done more work, I really don't know enough, and in exams I always run out of time. And this leads to a very different set of events and outcomes. You feel anxious, you experience physical symptoms of anxiety, you stay up late reading your notes, and you don't sleep very well. And the next day, you don't give it your best shot. So this example highlights the interaction between thoughts, feelings, behaviours, and physical sensations. And typically you find that clients with mental health difficulties are caught in a vicious circle, where negative thoughts lead to unpleasant emotions and self-defeating behaviours, which in turn reinforce the negative thoughts, and so on. Using the 4 systems model to explain how mental health difficulties are maintained can be a big source of relief for clients, because it makes sense of what has been for them a confusing and distressing series of symptoms. And it's important too, because once the maintenance cycle is clear, it can guide interventions. The question then for the client and the therapist to work together on is how the vicious cycle can be broken. And in many cases, the best way of doing this is for the client to question the accuracy or helpfulness of their negative thoughts, in the expectation that if they think differently, it will change the way they feel or behave. In other cases, it might be more effective to change their behaviour, in the expectation that if they behave differently, it will impact on the way they think and the way they feel. Now, with some clients, it's unnecessary to go beyond the simple 4 systems to help find strategies that they can use to disrupt the vicious cycle or vicious circle that they're in. But with others, and as was the case when Dee and I worked together, we needed to go into a bit more depth. Now, so far, I've been talking about cognition as if it was a single concept. In fact, in CBT, we would often distinguish between different levels of cognition. At the most fundamental level, there are core beliefs, which are usually learned in childhood. Core beliefs are more than thoughts. They are like DNA. They are written into our bloodstream. They are absolute beliefs that we know fundamentally to be true, and which usually take the form of absolute statements about ourselves. For example, I am stupid, I am bad. About other people. For example, people are unpredictable. Or about the world in general. The world is a dangerous place. Then we have dysfunctional assumptions, or what we sometimes call rules for living, which are more specific in their application than core beliefs. They usually take the form of conditional if-then propositions, or are framed as should or must statements. They often represent attempts to live with negative core beliefs. For example, if I feel that I'm unlovable, I may develop a rule for living which goes something like, if I please other people, they will put up with me. Or if I try to assert my own needs, I will be rejected. Now, these dysfunctional assumptions offer a guide to how to run our lives to overcome some of these effects, the effects of the core belief. But they are fragile. What makes these assumptions dysfunctional is that they are too rigid and too overgeneralized, not flexible enough to cope with inevitable setbacks of life. If a dysfunctional assumption is broken, for example, suppose I fail to please someone, then it's likely to generate unpleasant emotions and also a stream of negative automatic thoughts, or NATs, which all of us experience and almost all of us can notice if we try to pay attention to them. So if I just ask you to think about a recent time when you became upset, anxious, annoyed, down in the dumps, perhaps think about, the negative automatic thoughts that come through your mind. Negative automatic thoughts come out of the blue. They're plausible and they make us feel bad. We often swallow them whole as statements of fact. For example, if I think I'm absolutely useless when I'm feeling fed up with something that's gone wrong, it seems a simple statement of fact, a simple statement of truth. And one of the central strategies of CBT is to help clients stop swallowing negative automatic thoughts as simple statements of fact, so that they can step back and consider their accuracy. In CBT, it's helpful to think of thoughts not as facts, but as opinions. And like all opinions, they may not be accurate and they need to be questioned. And at the bottom of this figure, in addition to negative automatic thoughts and unpleasant emotions, we also have physical sensations and behaviour, which make up the other two elements of the CBT maintenance cycle. Dee and I worked together to apply this model to her situation, and the results of this are in the following diagram, which she's going to talk about.
So here's the model as it applied to me. Early experiences were physical and emotional abuse from a mother who was sole caregiver. The first core belief that Ian and I uncovered was I am unloved and unlovable, with a secondary belief, if people get to know the real me, they'll reject me. Later on, we identified another primary core belief. I'm irreparably damaged by my childhood and will never be able to lead a normal life, from which followed, it's only a matter of time before the good things in my life, particularly my work, go wrong and I won't be able to cope. My dysfunctional assumptions were that I must keep my guard up in relationships and not reveal too much about myself, otherwise I'll be rejected. And if I work hard and don't have any fun, then I will avoid criticism, which would destroy the only good thing in my life, my work. So following the triggers, my NATs would be a constant stream of self-critical thoughts which were tiring and demoralising. Constant what-if worries about things that could go wrong and that I'd be unable to cope. And an idea always that people were just about to see through me and find out I'm not normal and I never will be. Obviously, this led to anxiety and low mood. My physical sensations were that I was permanently tense and anxious, suffering from migraines, racing mind, difficulty falling and staying asleep, obviously feeling exhausted all the time. And my behaviours were doing everything to a very high standard, avoiding having any fun, keeping my distance in social relationships, up to the point where I was avoiding leaving home, especially if I was alone and going somewhere unfamiliar. Here is our plan of attack, or engagement if you prefer, but to me it was most definitely a joint attack by the two of us against a common enemy. So we had strategies to stop worrying and ruminating, behavioural experiments, imaginary scripting, and building more positive core beliefs. And now I'm just going to spend a bit of time illustrating how we worked on each of these fronts. So in very early session, Ian offered me this worry decision tree flowchart. So I asked myself, what am I worrying about? Is there anything I can do about it? If no, stop worrying and distract yourself. If yes, work out what you could do or how to find out what to do. Make a list. Is there anything I can do right now? Yes, I could. Do it. Then you can stop worrying and distract yourself. If no, plan what you could do and when. Stop worrying and distract yourself. Now you know it is safe to let your worries drop. Now, I responded to this rather aggressively, but while it made complete sense to me, if I could do what it suggested, I'd hardly need to be seeing him. He calmly and immediately said that it was just one of the many tools in his kit, and if this one wasn't useful to me right now, he had plenty others. And 3 years later, it's a tool I completely internalised and regularly use to self-manage my anxiety, and which gives me great peace, but it was of no use then. And I can see now that in those very early days, Ian was putting most of his focus into building our relationship. He consistently demonstrated that he valued and respected me as a whole person, so I was able to trust and respect him. And later on, his consistent modelling behaviours meant that I came to trust and respect myself. Now, someone quite famous once said, there were 3 of us in the relationship. Well, there were 3 of us in our relationship also. Ian, me, and a client. Together, Ian and I designed behavioural experiments for the client to do, and then he and I together would analyse the results. So, a behavioural experiment is a planned experiential activity to gather evidence, to test predictions that follow from unhelpful cognitions. And here's one of ours. So the target cognition, the thought and belief assumption that we were testing, was that if people get to know me, they'll reject me. And I believe that 100%. So our behavioural experiment was for me to invite a work colleague for lunch. My prediction was that neither of us will enjoy ourselves and the other person wouldn't want to see me again. And what did happen? Well, we had a lovely time. There were lots of laughs. We found we had lots of things in common beyond work. She suggested we do it again, and I had more fun than I had in ages. So what did I learn? What does the result say about the original belief? It said that the more I can be my authentic self, the more people will like me. It's just normal to get on with some people more than others. And that led me to reduce my belief to 10% from 100. Now, Ian and I keep talking about how important the relationship is between the therapist and the client. And because I came to trust Ian so completely, I allowed him to take me to some really dark and painful places. Ian asked me to replay an incident which frequently caused me flashbacks, and he audio recorded me describing an incident in the present tense. So I chose an incident which gave me very strong visual and emotional, repeated, frequent flashbacks of being pinned down on the stairs by my mother, aged about 12, and she was beating me with a rubber-soled slipper, and she was screaming at me, "I deal with problem children all day, I don't need to come home to one." As you can imagine, it was really traumatic to close my eyes, reimagine, revisualise and re-describe this experience. And he didn't offer any commentary or sympathy. He simply asked me next to replay the end of that scene with the adult D coming in, rescuing D, remonstrating with the perpetrator and taking her to safety. And he recorded that as well. Quite an exhausting session, but that wasn't the end of it. My homework for the 3 weeks in between our sessions was to listen to that audio recording every day. So every morning I'd wake up really anxious, palpitations, sweating, dreading the prospect of having to listen to this 15-minute recording. And for the first few days it was as traumatic as living it the first time. But amazingly, by the end of the 3 weeks, not only did I change the way I felt about that incident, it seems to have been absolutely core in changing how I felt about my mother, how I felt about myself, and how I felt about my life. Building more positive core beliefs. How would you like to be and how would that person behave? core beliefs come in pairs. In normal development, both of these beliefs will be taught through parenting and will happily coexist in the emerging adult. Now, you may remember that I had a core belief that I was unloved and unlovable, and you may also remember that this is in the description of personality disorders. I got that message consistently from an early age, so of course I believed it was an immutable fact. So we turned our spotlight on the pair of these core beliefs. I can be loved and lovable. So I wrote a list of 10 things that to me were qualities of someone loved and lovable. And mine happened to be being easy in my own company and with others, having self-confidence, giving love as well as receiving it, empathising, being more insightful, being curious about the world and other people, doing the right thing because it's the right thing, travelling an honourable path, taking care of myself, taking a risk and opening myself to uncertainty, and being honest with myself about my feelings. Now note that this had to be my self-defined list of qualities and characteristics. And revisiting this list for this talk, I was for the first time struck that these are all the sorts of things that are naturally taught to children by nurturing parents. And I was overwhelmed by the realisation of what a good parent I'd become to myself. So each day, for the month between our sessions, I tried to follow these new rules for living. And each evening, I'd reflect on the day just gone and record against each of the criteria things that I'd done which fitted with these new rules. And at the end of the month, I stopped. I stopped because I'd done behaviours with great attention and mindfulness. Getting good results each day reinforced the new behaviours, which in turn, over time, changed the thoughts. And by the end of the month, the feelings, and finally, this core belief, held since my earliest childhood, had changed. Bingo. Also, because we were working in partnership with this third person, instead of being overwhelmed by guilt and shame, I was able to stay in my adult so that I could really hear and understand what Ian was saying, suggesting and explaining, and hold on to that in between sessions. i.e. talking was not just cathartic, it also taught, encouraged and empowered me from the outset to be my own therapist and my own agent for change. CBT is evidence-based, as we've said. It also uses quantitative monitoring, both to evidence the success or otherwise of the intervention, and it's also used as part of the work. Here are my scores of over our 2+ years. So why were the mid-scores showing so little change? And this was a question that Ian put to me. And I suggested that because I was pushing out so much and so quickly, because I trusted him so much, I was changing my behaviours and taking lots of risks. So of course this was causing me a lot of anxiety. Now Ian bought this explanation and it proved to be true, based on my end of therapy scores. Finally, I want to talk to you about how easy or difficult it might be for the professional to work in partnership. Are you familiar with the Core 10 measurement tool? It asks the person to rate themselves against 10 criteria, and the higher the scores, the higher the distress or symptoms, as you can see here. So for example, over the last week, I felt tense, anxious or nervous. Not at all, only occasionally, sometimes, often, almost or all of the time. Now Ian started reporting to me that all my scores were consistently subclinical, i.e. in the healthy range. I never want to miss an opportunity to challenge those in authority. I asked Ian to start to complete his own Core 10 for each of our sessions. And a few months ago, I asked Ian to discharge me early from therapy, since he was consistently scoring higher than I was on the scale. You'll be happy to know that we were both in the healthy range. Now you may laugh, but I would just ask you to consider how you would feel if in your work with your clients, you scored yourself and then shared your scores with your clients. Really, I'm making a key point here about what partnership working can be in practice. And I hope that between us, we've demonstrated to you the enormity of what can be achieved into lasting effect.
so we were thinking about this final slide. What can we draw from this talk and from our experiences? I mean, certainly CBT is an evidence-based talking therapy, and as our case study demonstrates, it can be helpful to clients who've had a very long history of treatment and the use of mental health services. Our experience is you can't do talking therapy to people, you certainly can't do CBT to people, only with them. Partnership working, exploring together as two sort of scientists is the way forward. And also, not everything works. Some things don't work, some things are at the wrong time, but always something is learned and you can always move on to try something else. And the final thing, which comes back to the main theme of this summer school, is building resilience. It's the key goal of therapy. And it's achieved by building on the client's strengths and also producing a toolkit which will then allow them to become their own therapist. So thank you very much, and we have some time for questions.
When you say there's three relationships in the thingy, do you mean you two and another physical person, or like an imaginary kind of person that you were putting emotions onto?
I mean, in the therapeutic community, I did social work, where we would have an empty chair and we would move between chairs and take on different roles. And when Ian worked together, it wasn't like that. We just worked as a peer team with a mythical third client. I don't know if you want to add to that.
I mean, I think what we're saying is that, in a sense, we are working together to solve this person's problem. This person is actually D, the third person is D. But actually, in a sense, I think you were saying that because we work together, you could always use your adult self to work out, okay, well, what's going to, if we did this, what could happen? What could we predict what this third person would do? And it sort of worked, really. It wasn't just two of us in the relationship, it was Dee and me working together as co-therapists, almost, and Dee, who was having problems, who was the third person. Yeah.
When you talk about negative automatic thoughts, were you sort of judging those thoughts as something you should sort of disregard, or something you should respect, but see the other side? What was the balance of that sort of thing?
Well, there's various ways of trying to combat negative automatic thoughts. But I suppose the dominant way is that actually these thoughts present themselves as facts. They present themselves as the whole picture. They present themselves as, yes, this is a summary of your total situation. Now actually, that is probably not true. That in fact, they're a partial representation of the true situation. And actually what one tries to do in CBT is to say, well, let's examine that. It's not a fact, it's an opinion. What's the evidence for that thought? And yes, there is good evidence for it, but actually let's think, is there any counter evidence to that thought? So actually the client will then examine that thought as if it was an opinion and weigh it up. And the idea really is not to disprove the thought. The ideal really is to come to a more balanced thought. A balanced thought that takes account of everything and not just, the way you feel at the minute.
And that's how the behavioural experiments work, by testing out those thoughts that seem to be totally true. We examine if they are really true.
Do you think that can lead to like a healthy path though, with like constant questioning what we think?
I think the thing about it is that CBT is based upon a view that particularly when you're, say, down in the dumps or depressed, you make thinking errors. And actually, you may think in a particular way, but you think thinking errors. I mean, let's take an example. You're walking down the street. Somebody comes towards you that you know. They pass by. They don't acknowledge you. How do you interpret that? Well, there's various thoughts that could come through your mind. You could say, God, I knew she never liked me. She talked to me because she felt sorry for me, but I know that, she thinks I'm pathetic. Or you could think, stuck up cow, what is she doing ignoring me? I was with her all night last night. You know, so in a sense that's anger. Actually one generates anger, the other one generates depression. So the meaning of thoughts. Now actually, if you'd gone up to her, you'd probably find that those thoughts were not facts. She probably didn't see you. If you'd have gone up to her and said, well hang on a minute, you just passed me in the street, what happened there? You know, then in a sense you're checking out the validity of your thoughts. And a bit like this with Dee and the behaviour experiment, get people to behave in a different way and check out the thoughts and see if they're really true. Are they facts or are they opinions, and are they slanted towards a particular way of seeing the world, a negative way if you're depressed, an angry way if you like, if you're angry. Yeah?
Is there much also self-sabotaging? So when people that with depression and have these negative thoughts tend to sort of have self-hypothesis. If they have a negative image of themselves, they might sort of set up one of these behavioural experiments, then through their own thoughts, they'll act in a way that's actually going to make their prediction come true, so they create self-hypothesis. So how do you manage that risk?
But we're taking a neutral position of inquiry. So I'm not going to behave, I'm not going to undertake the experiment with my normal personality. I'm going to secretly conduct an experiment on my friend, and then I'm going to see whether my prediction, which I believe 100%, it's all going to fall apart, it's going to be horrible, it's going to be miserable, then we can evaluate together what actually happens.
I mean, I think that's absolutely right. I agree with Dee. In a way, you know, you're not, she's going out as an inquiry. Well, you know, you don't do experiments if you know what's going to be the outcome. You do experiments when you're not sure of the outcome. So that's the inquiry. But I think the point you do make is an important one, and it does mean that behaviour experiments, you don't just say to Dee, you know, well, go off there, invite your mate for dinner, let's see what happens. You'd actually sit down carefully to plan it. What would be your prediction? What do you think would happen? Well, they reject me. How would you know they rejected you? Well, they would say that I don't want to see you again. Okay, so that's fine. They'll say, I don't want to see you again. Or, what other things? Are they likely to say that? No, they're not, because they're polite. So, okay, well, they won't ring me again for 4 weeks, at least 4. So, there you've got your evidence. There you've got your behaviour. There you can test whether this is true or not. So, I think setting up the behavioural experiment in session beforehand is very important.
And it has to be done in partnership.
Yeah.
So in my case, we wouldn't have said, let's go 100 miles away to a place I've never been, on a train, have 2 bottles of wine each, and have to spend 8 hours together. We said, what can I reasonably tolerate, and what is a safe experiment for me to conduct? I definitely don't think a client can design and undertake a behavioural experiment on their own.
It's helpful just to talk it through, and actually, you know, they've got to be realistic but challenging.
Did you find as well that the 30 sessions that you engaged in was enough, you know, that gave you enough time to build that relationship?
Thank you. 30 is the maximum that I'm aware that any NHS trust allows. And because Ian was just so amazing, to start with I said, I can't do once a week, my life's too busy, and I want to get the most out of every session, so I want plenty of time to do my homework and hit my next difficulty before I see you. So to start with, we worked fortnightly, then we worked every 3 weeks, then every month, and then every 2 months. And that meant that I never got dependent on Ian. I was always in the driving seat, I was always having to solve my own problems and be my own therapist. And the graduation meant that more slowly I was able to be more and more independent.
Yeah, I mean, actually, Dee was very keen to have the 30 sessions, but then she insisted I discharge her after 28 because she was cured. So that, absolutely, I knew she was cured as well, so it's absolutely fine. I mean, but I would like to just say that this is very much a partnership. I mean, you've seen Dee today. If we'd have done this talk in 2011, we would have had a very different Dee talking from there. However, I would say that from the word go, Dee had huge strengths. Huge intelligence, able to grasp the model, able to see things, able to step outside herself. She'd also made tremendous progress in the therapy of the community. So we're talking here about someone who was motoring, and for a lot of our therapy, frankly, I was trying to keep up.
And I would add that I was also highly motivated because I was in such distress. I would do anything and try anything because how I was intolerable.
I'm sorry, we're going to have to stop that there because we could ask questions all day long. I'm sure we've all got loads more to ask. But I'd like to say a very warm thank
thank you to Delia.